Hundreds of thousands of COVID deaths, government reshuffles, a grumbling military. President Bolsonaro's record is devastating. Nevertheless, Germany should cultivate its close relationship with Brazil right now, because other powers have long recognized its potential. Brazil is being shaken by two severe earthquakes at the same time, a massive political government crisis and a corona-related state of emergency. At the center of both is a president, Bolsonaro, who does not seem to be able to cope with the situation for a long time. When it comes to corona, he is not alone in Latin America. The number of corona deaths per million inhabitants since the beginning of the pandemic is even higher in Mexico and Peru. And Mexico's President Andrés Manuel López Obrador believes he can protect himself from COVID-19 with an amulet. Nevertheless, the epidemic rages violently even in the largest country in the region with 210 million inhabitants. Over 300,000 Brazilians have already died. The daily death rate is approaching 4,000. The pandemic, long ridiculed by Bolsonaro as flu, is bringing the health system to the brink of collapse. Its systematic trivialization and this scourge is costing Brazil, in every respect, dearly. New mutations to be expected harbor further dangers. When former Captain Bolsonaro, who had been discharged from the armed forces after disciplinary problems, took over the government in early 2019, he tried to make the Brazilian military the key pillar of his power. He even appointed former General Hamilton Mourão as vice president. That, in turn, was more noticeable through clever speeches and moderate political statements than through populist slogans. But when Bolsonaro also dismissed the previous defense minister in a major cabinet reshuffle, the commanders of the three branches of arms jointly resigned in protest. This is a good sign for Brazil. The right-wing populist has not succeeded in using the armed forces to maintain his own power, an encouraging signal. For the political scientist Cristiano Romero, however, this does not mean that the president would learn anything from the current crisis. Bolsonaro only feels obliged to his own political universe, which he himself has created, and thus above all to his followers in the social media, the so-called Bolsominions. They are still estimated at 30% of the electorate and are largely recruited from Brazil's steadily growing reservoir of supporters of evangelical free churches. Bolsonaro was able to score precisely because he positioned himself against both the parties in the center, Centrão, and the left-wing Workers' Party, PT. In doing so, he broke through the political scheme that had emerged in the past decades after the country's return to democracy. He also succeeded because the traditional parties had lost their reputation due to various corruption scandals. A special coup was the appointment of Sergio Moro as Minister of Justice. As of 2014, as a public prosecutor, he was heavily involved in the uncovering of the so-called Lava Jato scandal, the largest anti-corruption campaign in Brazilian history. Moro has long since resigned and is now being branded a boogeyman by everyone involved in the scandal. His most prominent victim was the former President Lula da Silva of the PT, who is now at large again, due to some equally controversial decisions. Although legal proceedings are still pending against him, he firmly believes that he can run against Bolsonaro in next year's presidential election. A polarization of previously unknown proportions would thus be programmed for Brazil. Bolsonaro had distinguished himself in the election campaign in mid-2018 as an outsider and clean man who had come from the fringes of political circles. The fight against corruption was just as much on his agenda as a dedicated change of direction towards more economic openness. He also wanted to campaign for free competition and not least for a reform of the tough Brazilian bureaucracy. After all, the so-called Custo Brasil has traditionally been seen as the greatest obstacle to modernizing the Brazilian economy. Economics Minister Paulo Guedes, an internationally recognized banker and economist, stood for these reform approaches. For a not inconsiderable part of the currently rather leaderless political center of Brazil, it is a certain reassurance that Guedes is still in office. Not least because of Corona, he was unable to implement large parts of his reform agenda. He also has no political power to support him. He is only a competent expert. Nevertheless, Guedes steered Brazil through the crisis to some extent, despite populist guidelines from Bolsonaro. The country is in a better economic position than most of the countries in the region, especially Mexico. The Corona year 2020 became the second strongest export year in Brazilian history, with $101 billion in export income. 66% of exports go to Asia, half of them to China, which is increasingly becoming the most important partner of the South American agricultural giant. Bolsonaro, on the other hand, finds it difficult to acknowledge this fact. Until recently, he had leaned unilaterally on Donald Trump in terms of foreign policy, and had only kept a skeptical distance from Brazil's most important economic partner, Beijing. He was supported in this by his now sacked foreign minister, Ernesto Araújo, a conservative ideologist closely associated with Steve Bannon. Araújo steadfastly refused to import Chinese vaccines. The governor of the state of Sao Paulo, João Doria, a pragmatic entrepreneur who has also political ambitions in the elections next year, counted on this. The city of Sao Paulo and the surrounding state of the same name traditionally form the most important powerhouse in Brazil, and incidentally still the center of German industry. A good 1,600 companies of German origin are active in Brazil, generating around 10% of industrial value added. Germany is more closely connected to Brazil than most European countries. It has always advocated the conclusion of the EU-Mercosur Free Trade Agreement, the ratification of which now threatens to fail due to the agricultural interests of France, Ireland, and Austria. Paris in particular is cleverly manipulating the Amazon problem in order to torpedo the agreement. Bolsonaro, on the other hand, smashed a lot of international porcelain and isolated his country through his prepotent chatter and his preference for the Brazilian agricultural lobby. Verbal disarmament on all sides and a much more objective exchange of information are urgently needed. For example, Luis Fernando Furlan, Minister of Economics under Lula, likes to point out that 2/3 of Brazil still have the original forest cover and vegetation. Brazil is Germany's natural partner for achieving demanding and ambitious environmental goals. The country is an ecological pioneer and has long had an energy mix that other countries can only dream of. Brazil is also an ideal partner in the implementation of the ambitious hydrogen strategy. The prerequisites for solar and wind power are just incredible. All of this is known not only in Europe but also in China. Beijing has been positioning itself very skillfully in the entire region for a long time. Berlin and Brussels therefore have to do more. It's worth it, despite Bolsonaro. And if you want to stay informed, please subscribe to my channel. Auf Wiedersehen.